Hi everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you for the introduction, Juliana, and for the invitation to speak at today's event. Um, so yes, I've only been at DFT for a couple of months, but hopefully that's enough time for me to give you guys a decent insight in some of the recent developments in our department. It's probably worth flagging that I'm a senior policy advisor working in our buses and taxis division. So predominantly, a lot of my examples references today are going to be referring to the bus network. But I'll try and keep the conversation as broad as possible and as multimodal as possible. If I could have the next slide, please. Right. So if you hadn't noticed, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And it's fair to say that it's quite hard to remember what life was like beforehand. What was it a case of seamless, efficient, reliable, integrated services? Was it a case of friendly staff, cordial passengers, orderly queues at bus stops? Was it a case of traveling with friends, family, or on your own on a regular daily commute? Whatever the reality was, whatever the future holds, what is absolutely certain is that rural transport provides us with quite a unique challenge, quite a difficult challenge, mostly down to the fact that we have rural communities have quite diverse needs. The population is often incredibly dispersed, and not to mention the fact that the geography is often very unique. Next slide, please. So it's probably worth reflecting on some key statistics here, all of which you're probably familiar with before, but it helps provide a little bit of a context for the rest of the conversation. Bus travel in the UK has been declining over the last 50 plus years. Since 1982, it's halved. The level of ridership has halved, and at the same time, private car ownership has grown quite considerably. Equally, rural transport is a small proportion of the country's transport activity. Most activity takes place in urban areas. I suppose that's no surprise, but it's worth reminding ourselves of that. And what that does mean is that, as you can see on the map, it means that there's quite a mixed distribution across the country of patronage levels and ridership. Next slide, please. So that's sort of some context. We had since early this year, COVID-19 has joined us and created an incredibly different picture for public transport. As you can see on the graph, when the first lockdown kicked in, ridership levels on the bus network across the UK plummeted to approximately 10% of their normal levels, which is unprecedented. Since then, since the sort of easing of the first lockdown, as you can see, there was a gradual increase in ridership again, but that was slow, and I believe it peaked at something around 40%, and that was before the announcements of some new restrictions, just before the second lockdown was introduced. What have the DFT been doing? What have the government been doing for the public transport network during that time? I think the answer, as you'll probably not be surprised to learn, is quite a considerable amount. Since the start of COVID-19, we've invested nearly just coming up to £1 billion in the bus network alone to provide a subsidy and emergency support for bus operators and local authorities that helps address predominantly the issue of reduced capacity caused by social distancing measures. We remain committed to providing that level of support. But our main focus now, now that that's sort of ticking over, is planning for the future and trying our best to understand the options for transitioning the network from a sector that is heavily dependent on subsidies through a transition and reform period to a future where everything is stable again. At what level we don't know, and able to stand on its own 2 feet, and where we can actually start investing significant amounts of money in transforming the network so that it's fit for the future. Next slide, please. So speaking of investment, there's been an incredible amount of investment. Oh, back a slide, please. Incredible amount of investment this year, and there's going to be more in the years ahead. So last year, the government announced a better deal for bus users, which was a £220 million package covering a multitude of different projects. From a rural transport perspective, the most relevant of those is the Rural Mobility Fund, which, as Juliana mentioned, I'm currently leading on. It's a £20 million trial to explore the benefits and options relating to demand responsive transport in rural and suburban settings. An update on that, we received an incredible amount of interest, 56 bids received from a variety of local authorities up and down the country. We've been reviewing those since June, and we're just coming up to the end of that process, and hopefully we'll be in a position to announce the outcome of phase 1 next month. That will leave us in a position where we'll probably be ending up working with something in the region of 15 to 20 different local authorities in the new year, working with them to write business cases to justify the investment and hopefully release the funding before the end of the financial year. It's fair to say that the standard of the bids has been incredibly strong, and it's been a difficult challenge to identify where best to spend the money, because undoubtedly the rural communities are areas that need investment across the UK. Other areas of the better deal for bus users included an all-electric bus town competition, where we have currently shortlisted Oxford and Coventry, and are working with them to become the first fully electric bus towns in the UK. And again, we'll be working with them for the rest of the financial year to get those projects up and running. Another thing worth mentioning was the announcement of a fares pilot. That's yet to get started, but we're still working with Cornwall to understand their proposals for what could be done in that space. And the idea there is exploring how fares subsidy can be used to generate increases in patronage on the network. And lastly, on better deal for bus users, I need to talk about the national bus strategy. That announcement committed us to writing and publishing the first ever long-term strategy for buses for the UK. Again, we're working on that piece of work, and what we're expecting to do is to be able to publish that at some point in the early part of 2021. And that will hopefully provide the sector with some clarity on the way the government sees the future direction of buses in the UK, and where we intend to focus our activity. So that brings us, from an investment perspective, up to sort of present day, where early this year, just before COVID hit, the Prime Minister announced a £5 billion package for buses, cycling and walking, of which £3 billion was to be allocated to buses. As some of you may be aware, the Chancellor announced the spending review outcomes yesterday in Parliament, and in that made reference to the bus transformation and announced the first tranche of funding in the form of £300 million to provide ongoing COVID support and also to start introducing some reform to the network. And another key sort of pledge relating to bus transformation has been a commitment to introduce 4,000 new zero emission buses. And again, £120 million of funding has been released as part of the recent spending review that will kick off the purchase of the first 500 of those buses and any associated infrastructure. Next slide, please. So, what's happening in the world of active travel? So, as I mentioned, there was a £5 billion announcement early this year on buses, cycling, and walking. 2 billion of which is to be invested in the latter over the next 5 years. It's fair to say that during lockdown, there was quite an increased interest in cycling as a mode of transport, and what the DfT are keen to do is to sort of exploit that, take advantage of the fact that more people are reverting to active travel as an alternative, particularly whilst public transport services are slightly restricted in capacity. And so we want to use that as an opportunity for a green restart. So part linked to that, the government released £225 million this financial year via the Active Travel Fund to provide local authorities with money to invest in enhancing facilities for cycling and walking. And linked to that was a £25 million package for cycle repair vouchers to give people the opportunity to dust off their bike and spend some cash in getting it roadworthy again and use it as their mode of choice. More recently, during the summer, the Prime Minister announced Gear Change, which is a bold vision for cycling and walking. In that, it covers a multitude of different things, but most importantly, there are 33 commitments in there, many of which have significant relevance to rural areas. So just to pull out a few of those, one of them talks about improving the national cycle network. There's a feeling that the current national cycle network, all 12,000 miles of it, is overly focused on leisure travel, and that there might be opportunities there to make better use of that network. We're also interested in working with rail operators and bus operators to explore opportunities for improving the capacity on those services for accepting cycles. So that's an interesting new space we want to explore. We've also committed to introducing a new commissioning body, an inspectorate called Active Travel England, and the intention for them is yet to be defined, but it's ultimately about giving them a responsibility for controlling the release of funding to bidders and having an influence in future developments so that they adequately consider the role of active travel in their plans. And then the final thing, sort of commitment to pull out, was about a national e-bike support program. That's again something in its infancy, but it's a commitment to say that we want to explore the opportunities that e-bikes provide. My father himself he's an e-bike user, has health issues, and I for one can say from personal experience that it's a mobility solution that can provide real genuine benefits to people that might otherwise find it difficult to travel independently. One of the themes that's worth mentioning that throughout the whole cycling and walking agenda is the one of inclusive cycling. If you read Gear Change, you'll notice that there's a thread running through about trying to move away from this I guess I could just fairly describe it as sort of an over-dominance of the sort of white middle-age, middle-class, lycra-clad cyclist, to make sure that as a nation we recognise that the cycling should be a choice for all, that everyone should be willing to should be able to explore and benefit from. Next slide, please. So I'll touch briefly on the world of decarbonisation, as there's probably some people in the room with a lot more experience than I do in this area. But it is worth highlighting that, again, something that many of you may already be aware is that transport is now the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's taken over that top spot from energy in recent years. And that's mainly down to the fact that the energy sector have made some huge improvements in that space, whilst the transport network has only seen a 3% reduction over recent years. We've got an ambitious target of being net zero across the whole economy by 2050, and it's fair to say that it's a very real challenge. And our current policy positions, projections indicate that it's going to be incredibly difficult for us to meet the target we've set ourselves. So what is undoubtable is that the government are going to have to make some very bold decisions if they want to still meet those targets. And I think I'm allowed to say that a fair example of that might be the decision to bring forward the cessation of sales of petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. It's a bold decision, and it's going to be again another challenge to implement. But I think it sends a signal out to the country that the government are very, very much interested in still meeting that target and decarbonising our transport network. Next slide, please. So again, just talking briefly on this, it's worth making you all aware that there's a document that we published earlier in the year, I think in March, called Decarbonising Transport, Setting the Challenge. That basically outlined the scale of the challenge in front of us to deal with decarbonisation in transport, and what it's done is set out some key priorities, as illustrated there. It links in very closely with another recent announcement that you may be aware of from last week, where the Mayor announced, and again it was mentioned in the spending review yesterday, his 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and one of those points relates to public transport. So I think that the takeaway from this slide is just basically to say that when we're talking about the future of public transport in the UK and in rural areas, what is that without question is that the decarbonisation agenda, the green agenda, is going to heavily shape whatever solutions are on the horizon. Okay, next slide, please. So speaking of the future, there are going to be a huge number of developments over the coming years that are going to involve automation of transport, electrification, improvement in data collection and access. And what our Future for Transport programme is looking at is understanding the role of government in making sure that these new innovations provide a benefit to all. So there's always a risk of an overly urban focus, and one that neglects to address the needs of rural communities. And we see our role in the DFT of making sure that all of these future innovations are of benefit to everyone. Next slide, please. So you may think it's a little bit bizarre for me to mention an urban strategy in a meeting about rural transport, but these principles that I've just put up on the slide here are universal, and they apply ultimately to all parts of the country. This strategy was published last year, and it basically sets out our approach for maximising the benefits and mitigating the risks associated with new innovation. I think we can all think of examples of new innovation which can provide a real game changer in terms of opportunity, but equally they can bring and introduce new challenges, new hazards, new risks to the community. And what these principles are in place to do is to set out a sort of a guide for developers, for local authorities, and equally for government departments, to say that, okay, we need to make sure that things are safe for users and other people that are affected by these new innovations. We need to make sure that they're accessible to all segments of society, and equally we need to make sure that we sort of promote active travel and mass transit to make sure that they aren't disadvantaged by other new innovations that are introduced. Next slide, please. And the main reason for mentioning those new principles and the urban strategy is the fact that earlier this week we kicked off a call for evidence for a rural strategy. We recognise the importance of mobility and transport in a rural setting and the unique challenges that brings. And what we're doing is, with this call for evidence, is to understand your views and sort of seek better to understand what the trends are, what sort of opportunities of innovation might be being developed, and that we might not be aware of, and also to understand what you guys believe the government's approach should be in that sphere. What level of involvement should we have, and how can we support the rural community to make sure that you have access to these new innovations, and that they are of benefit to you and not introducing unnecessary risk. We intend to, so this call for evidence will be ending in February, and the expectation is that we'll be able to publish a rural strategy for future of transport by the end of next year. Next slide, please. And so the final thing to mention, which is incredibly closely linked to that, is this regulatory review that we're in the middle of. It's a 3-year review, and it's about making sure that we, as a department, have a good handle and a good grasp on the new innovations that are maybe already in use or are on the horizon. It's about making sure that we're able to encourage and support their rollout in a safe manner. It's also about making sure that we have the right and appropriate regulatory framework in place for these new innovations to ensure that they are safe, and that local authorities and the government have the powers necessary to enforce and to sort of ensure compliance for each of those new services. And we have already started engaging with academia, with industry on this, and other stakeholders to try and to understand the challenges and opportunities. And the ambition is that, as I say, that we'll be able to complete this and publish our government response. Sorry, we have published our government response, and just a few days ago, and we now in a position where we need to deliver on some of the responses that we've received. Okay, that's all from me. So any questions are welcome, but please be gentle with me. I have only been in the department for the last 2 months, but I will try my best.
Thanks, Jamie. My camera's having a bit of a wobble, so I'll stay on microphone. Hopefully you can see the Q&A in the chat bar. So people have been voting up questions for you. So we're going to get through as many as we can before our next speaker. So the first question says, hi Jamie, does DFT have any good examples or case studies where rural areas have already implemented successful public transport schemes and the partners they've worked with to achieve successes?
Oh goodness, that is a question. I'm not sure whether I know the answer to that one. I mean, I think I've described some of the ones where we are currently working with the rural community, or we have a sort of developing a commitment to. I don't think I do, but what I can do is I can take that question away and provide examples, if that
That's
helps.
fine. We can come back to that. We've got another question here from Jane Yardley. Will the funds for cycling include increasing cycle lanes and lighting in rural areas where there is no street lighting, i.e. a motion sensor triggered lighting system or something similar to make it safer?
So my understanding of the situation we're in with the space and cycling is that we have this 225 million package for cycling, and the government's basically working with each of the local authorities to understand what the needs are in those specific areas. So some of that involves building new cycle lanes. Some of that involves providing sort of storage facilities, all sorts of things. And I think this is not just true of the active travel space, but true across the whole of sort of transport. Is that we very much recognise that there's no one size fits all solution for communities, and I think it's probably even more true of rural transport than urban transport. That naturally we need to be led by the local community as to what those solutions and priorities are, and hence why with a lot of these funds, as much as it's painful for and resource intensive for local authorities, we do run bidding processes to understand and sort of the local area to dictate what they believe, how they believe the money could best be spent.
Thanks, Jamie. We've got another question here from Ronald Whittle. He's put a point here: 1 billion for buses, much of which is urban support, but virtually nothing for coach operators who provide many vital services such as schools, transport, work services, etc. And he's saying no subsidy or no support, no coaches. That's
something I'm not familiar with. I mean, I have sympathy with his view there, definitely. What I can do is, again, I think I need to take that away because I'm not familiar with in the coaches space. It's undoubtedly something we need to, I need to respond on.
There's a couple of people have asked here, how can they contribute to the evidence for the rural strategy? What's the way that they can access that? Is there a link?
Oh yeah, so it's on DFT website. There's some documentation on there that outlines exactly sort of how you can engage with the DFT. I can send around the link if that helps.
Yeah, that's great. We'll pop that in the chat for everybody.
And then and basically, we welcome any parts of business or otherwise. Please, your views are welcome and help shape the strategy.
Are your slides going to be available after the presentation?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I don't think there's any lies on there. My colleagues have endorsed it. So yeah, absolutely. You're more than welcome to have copies of the slides.
Okay. A couple more questions that we can slip in. There's a question from Julian Dean. There is a suggestion that rail has effectively been renationalised due to COVID. How does this look with buses? is the ownership model likely to look different coming out of this?
So yeah, I think you could, Julian. I think you're right. I think you could argue that case for the bus network as well. That as things stand, there's been an incredible amount of subsidisation happening just to protect the sector and maintain those services. In terms of the future, I was actually having a chat with one of the colleagues on here earlier about it's very incredibly difficult to know what the future holds. I think what's fair to say is that the DfT's position with all of this is we want, whilst it is absolutely a deregulated network, and the expectation is for that to continue. We want to use sort of the post-COVID recovery phase, whatever that looks like, to make the most of some of the mechanisms and the frameworks that are already in place, through sort of legal mechanisms, to build stronger partnerships between bus operators and local authorities, because we're incredibly passionate that is a space where that joint working, that partnership working between those two spheres can really sort of come up with solutions that benefit customers.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. There is quite a few more questions here that we haven't managed to get through because we are now ready for our next speaker. So I will keep hold of those, and if we can ask you to respond via email, and we can share your responses with them.
Yeah, happily.
If that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Jamie. Really, really interesting. It's actually really good to know we've got somebody like Jamie as a senior policy advisor responsible for buses in DfT. So I hope your secondment is long lasting, Jamie. So thank you.